Hello and welcome to this short video on register when considering the English language in terms of its purpose and its delivery. So, first of all, there's two types of register that we use when describing a particular piece of work. And we might say that it's formal or informal. And there's obviously a whole range between those two extremes. And today we're going to look at them in quite some detail. So first of all, if we consider communicating with friends and family, we tend to talk very informally. So what are those features of informal language? Well, here I've taken a standard extract that could be males, females talking. That part of it doesn't come into it. We're not looking at gender and linguistics here. We're just looking at language features. And you can see that I've extracted a part where somebody says, yeah, I don't know what she's talking about, but, she always makes me laugh. Now, we can identify here a range of features which make this quite informal, relatively speaking. So first of all, we have the use of contractions, and there's two there with I don't know what she's talking about. So in both cases, this don't, if it were formal or if it were more formal, would be do not know. Likewise, it would be she is talking about rather than she's talking about. So they're just standard contractions that we use in a range of different ways. We've also got this phrase talking about, and arguably I would say this is quite a colloquial expression. It's something that we tend to use just to build rapport with the person that we're speaking to show a little bit more emotion, a little bit more subjectivity. We also have this yeah, and this again is I've put here a colloquial interjection. Yeah can be an adverb, it can be an interjection. In this case, I've argued that it's an interjection. Nevertheless, we're seeing yeah rather than yes. And again, with the language that it's accompanying, the fact that it's spoken, all of these things mean it's probably more towards the informal side of the spectrum. We've also got further colloquial expressions. We call these fillers sometimes. They give us a little bit of time to think about what we're going to say next. Like here, like when you say as you're processing your thoughts, you might use these filling expressions as seen here. So if we flip that, we then go over to the formal side. And when we go to the formal type environment, our language will change. It will reflect the formality of our environment. So you can see here I've taken a picture of a lecturer giving a lecture. So he's amongst peers, he's amongst people who may have a similar job to him, or he may be speaking to his students, and therefore he's going to increase the degree of his formality in his language. So I've taken an extract from a lecture, and it really does show a range of formal behaviors in language. So let's have a look. Therefore, it would be very apparent, even objectively speaking, that the data was extracted using a less than satisfactory method. Now, apart from sounding a little bit like something Sherlock Holmes would say, it does reveal quite a lot about the English language and formality. So first of all, we've got this therefore, and therefore is a discourse marker. It's a synonym of consequently. And if we were to make it more informal, we could simply say so. But therefore makes it considerably more formal and therefore appropriate for his environment. Discourse markers, by the way, are linguistic features. They're parts of language which navigate, which give directions to the listener to what the speaker is saying. So it's like they're holding up signposts and saying, this is what I'm going to say next. So for example, if somebody says to you, however, you know they're going to give you an opposite argument. They're going to say something opposite to what they've said before. Okay, we also have examples of impersonal language. Now, this phrase here, even objectively speaking. It's quite a formal phrase, and it, due to its meaning, it hints at the fact that it is objective, that it is impersonal. There's not necessarily any semantic features here. There's no direct features of objectivity. For that, we'd be looking at the passive. We'd be looking at referring to yourself in the third person, all those kind of features. Lack of personal pronouns. All of these kind of things make up impersonal language, but in this case, objectively speaking, does provide the meaning is implied that way. Okay, as I mentioned before, the passive voice. The passive voice is a big feature of formal language, and in the passive, what it does is it changes a sentence. It changes the order of a sentence, so that the verb is acting upon the subject. So rather than the subject carrying out the verb is acting upon the subject. And this is done for a range of reasons. And I will be creating a video all about the passive voice in the next few days. Next up, we need to just point out, as I said earlier on, that yes, when we talk about register, we say formal and informal, but it is a spectrum. There is a spectrum of formality. For example, you may speak to your parents differently to how you speak to your friends, and again, you may speak to your teachers different to how you speak to your parents. And there are varying degrees, there are different degrees of formality that you will use at different points of contact, at different people that you talk to. Likewise, the environment you're in. If you're in a job interview, for example, you're going to use very formal language. Whereas if you're in an arcade, or if you're in a gym, or playing football or whatever, you're going to be using very informal language. So the environment can dictate what kind of formality you use, as well as the audience. Something else to think about, as well as the environment and the audience, is the purpose of the text or speech. For example, in a job interview, you want to answer the questions so that you can try and persuade the interviewer that you are the most important, you are the best position, you are the best candidate, sorry, for the job, for the role. When you're with your friends, more likely you are wanting to entertain them or to relax. So obviously, when we use language for different purpose, that also has an effect on the level of formality. Now, somewhere where we might see this every day is when we think about different types of news that we have access to. So if, for example, you are to buy a broadsheet newspaper, you'll notice that the language tends to be very formal, and it also attempts to be very objective. Now, we have to be very careful with saying that newspapers, broadsheet newspapers, are objective, because there's always a little bit of space for subjectivity, influence, and all those kind of things. But generally speaking, the language tends to be objective. And objective language, as we talked about earlier on, can be the passive voice and its lack of personal pronouns. So, for example, you would never read, I think this. It tends to be sentences like, it is thought. So these are things to look out for. Again, you won't see, you'll rarely see contractions in broadsheet newspapers. Language is typically delivered in a formal way. The reason that this is done, the reason that broadsheet newspapers use more formal language, is to give it a significant degree of legitimacy. In other words, if you read a broadsheet newspaper, it is less likely to be what Donald Trump would call fake news. It is more likely to that all of the information in there has come from legitimate sources, that the information does have a paper trail, it does have some kind of trail. So therefore, when people read broadsheet newspapers, they tend to believe the news based on the fact that it adopts formal language and also its target audience is for those who want to be informed. On the other hand, we have a tabloid newspaper, and tabloids tend to be noticeably more informal. So they tend to do things like capitalize every other word. They want to sensationalize. They want it to so that when you're walking past it, you want to buy it because you want to be entertained. And so the language has to be structured and it has to be presented in this way. And another really important point to mention is that tabloid newspapers actually have a much smaller vocabulary that they can draw from because they want to attract a much larger target audience. So as it says here in the second bullet point, that their primary aim really is to entertain rather than inform. And be careful if you're ever writing a school report, an essay, just be aware that, strictly speaking, we would never tend to use tabloid newspapers as a legitimate source of information unless we were acknowledging that it came from a tabloid newspaper. If it was part of an analysis on language or something like that. But if you're using it to back up an argument, it would be very unlikely that you would use a tabloid newspaper. So these features here, the fact that it tends to be more informal, the fact that it wants to entertain rather than inform, means that it fails to give a significant degree of legitimacy. So that, as I said, you wouldn't really use it as a source for your school essays or anything like that. It tends to focus on gossip and that sort of stuff. So that brings us to the end of this short video. I hope you found it useful. It's all about register and the degrees of formality. Thank you.